we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always like to say, you know, if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to the video and to our channel. It really helps. It really helps us spread the word if you give us a 5-star review wherever you're listening. And you know, tell your friends. If you tell one friend, it'll grow the podcast overnight. And always encourage them if they ever want. You know, reach out to me on Instagram or Twitter at the Bigmark Pod, at the Bigmark Podcast. Hit us up on our DMs there, and then you can check out our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod, and support the podcast that way. Thank you so much to all of our current Patreons, subscribers, if you will. I just watched the new Batman movie, and I thought, why not do an episode on it? And I threw my Riddler glasses on, which these are now, which I thought when I was watching the movie, I'm like, are these glasses out? The clear ones? They're so cool. I don't want them to be out. I don't want to be associated with the Riddler. Anyway, quick spoiler alert for all the people that are actually interested in wanting to know what the movie's all about if you haven't seen it yet. So stop the podcast now and go watch the movie if you don't want any spoilies. If not, I'm trying not to do it too bad, but you know what I'm going to talk about. You never know. It could ruin the movie for you. I'm kind of that kind of guy, like, it's kind of impossible to avoid spoilers now, but, like, unless someone tells you scene for scene what the movie is, even if they tell you a little bit about it, how can it ruin the whole thing? I mean, I guess there's certain plot points, but, oh well, what can you do? So, The Batman, 2022, so it was being filmed during the Pandy Wandy, which apparently had its own pitfalls, which I didn't really do too much research in, so I won't go too much into the actual making of the film, although there's some cool points that I will make. It's directed by Matt Reeves. Matt Reeves also did Cloverfield and Planet of the Apes movies, so like all those Cloverfield movies that had like monsters and stuff, and then the new Planet of the Apes with like the rise of the Planet of the Apes and the War of the Planet of the Apes, like when they're the humans are doing the experiments on the monkeys that actually become like the monkeys that rule Earth in the future. Anyway, if you haven't seen Planet of the Apes, the old school one, or even the reboot with old Marky Mark, essentially humans do experiments on apes like chimpanzees, and they eventually become so intelligent that they take over the Earth and blah, blah, blah. And anyway, Matt Reeves directed those movies. Really, really stellar cast. You got Robert Pattinson as Batman, Bruce Wayne, of course. You got Zoe Kravitz as Selena Kyle and Catwoman, Colin Farrell as the Penguin, Jeffrey Wright as Jim Gordon, Andy Serkis as Alfred, and Paul Dano as the Riddler. And, you know, it's always interesting when you're casting a comic book movie. So, I mean, something like Batman, you know, there's so much more than just the comics now, too. There's all the other movies that have happened. There's all the cartoons and everything else on top of the comics. But, you know, mostly the main storylines that are even a part of those kind of do come from the comics anyway. But because that's true, and this goes for like any literary movie based off books, movies based off whatever, and already an idea that already exists, it's always hard to cast a certain character that's going to fit that profile. So like in a book that doesn't have any pictures, it's a little bit more leeway because you can be like, okay, that's not exactly who I imagined in my head when I was reading the description by the author, but okay, that's cool. Like they still act like the character. I can get behind it. But comic books, they literally have artwork that goes on with it. We tend, you know, each artist is going to do a little bit of a different rendering of the characters, but essentially, if it's the same artist, we get to know what these characters already look like. So again, the challenge of casting any character in a comic book movie is such a challenge. Like, you know, in my lifetime, it was Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man. You know, people didn't really know too much about him. You know, he's in Pleasantville, and he was kind of more of a child actor, friends with Leonardo DiCaprio. And I mean, you know, it wasn't outlandish. It wasn't a stretch to imagine him as Peter Parker, but again, no one can imagine, you know, him as Spider-Man, and people are like, oh, why would they pick him? Why didn't they pick all these other people? And then, like, to go even further back, I remember my dad telling me about when they chose Michael Keaton to play the first Batman, and people, well, not the first Batman, but the 1989 Batman. People were like, Michael Keaton's a comedian. How is he going to possibly play a good Bruce Wayne and be Batman? He's not that kind of guy. And he ended up being a great job. I mean, you know, he's the first to really do it in the modern movies. Obviously, you can take Adam West from the 1966 television show as potentially the first Batman. And I think there's even one from earlier, like a live action Batman, I should say. But for the intents and purposes of today, Michael Keaton's the first guy, so he really cracked the crust there. But he kind of proved to everyone that, you know, for preconceived notions aside, you know, these actors are actors. It doesn't matter who they've been before. You know, they can kind of show their stuff. So I always think, you know, when these new movies, when they were talking about casting Robert Pattinson, you know, everyone's like, oh, the Twilight guy, blah, blah, blah. In fact, he played a vampire, which Batman might as well be a vampire. So if anything, people should have been like right on. But as soon as I heard, I was like, oh, okay, Robert Pattinson, maybe not my first choice as Bruce Wayne, but again, I always reserve my judgments just because of that whole Michael Keaton thing. And then Robert Pattinson, he kind of plays more of that brutish, like emo Bruce Wayne. He's young. It's only 2 years into Bruce Wayne being Batman. So he's, you know, it's not year one, which is a really cool graphic novel series, but, you know, he's just kind of still getting the hang of things. He's really pushing his boundaries, and that's an interesting Batman, you know, from the comics, and just thinking about it, because he's kind of learning about what he's learning how far he can push himself, because, you know, in the comics, you kind of wonder how does Batman even know what his body's capable of, and how far he can go, and all that stuff. And it's because of these early years and him kind of like learning the ropes, so to speak. Zoe Kravitz is phenomenal as Catwoman. It's a great take on Catwoman. Pretty classic homage to Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman from Batman Returns. But Catwoman as a cat burglar is always kind of a great trope for her. And in the movie, she's Carmine Falcone's daughter, which is really cool. That does come from I believe comes from a comic book series, which we'll touch on later. Colin Farrell again is tremendous as the Penguin. The makeup and visual effects for him are like top notch. If you didn't know that it was Colin Farrell, you would never realize it. He doesn't look like him at all. He doesn't sound like him, but he does a great acting job. He kind of has a Tony Soprano vibe to him, and I think I heard in an interview that Colin Farrell was kind of going for that, you know, gangster mob boss kind of New York kind of thing. And you can really see it not only in his appearance, but just in his demeanor, which is really cool. But again, the makeup was just amazing, and they really made him look like Alex Ross's Penguin. So Alex Ross is a great comic book artist, and I'll show a picture here on YouTube for everyone who's watching. You can clearly tell that Matt Reeves took, or at least the designers of the Penguin character took inspiration from Alex Ross's design here, which is super cool. But again, that whole mob boss kind of aspect, but up and coming, because at the point where you meet the Penguin in the movie, Carmine Falcone is still running the crime in Gotham City. Jeffrey Wright is Jim Gordon. This is Detective Jim Gordon, right? So this is pre-Commissioner Gordon. He does an excellent job. I always loved Jeffrey Wright from Westworld. He was so good in that show. If you haven't watched that show, please check it out. Andy Serkis plays a wicked Alfred. He's kind of more that tough, badass Alfred. In some of the comic books, in comic book stories, Alfred is kind of more of this like ex-war hero, protector. Again, it makes sense if you're the Wayne family, you want to kind of have protection. Although he's your butler, and someone who's going to take care of your child. When things go wrong, you want someone who has some abilities. And I'll get into later, kind of some of the important points of the plot. I'll kind of touch back on that whole Alfred thing, which I think is really interesting. But Andy Serkis again does a great job. And then Paul Dano as the Riddler is a very interesting Riddler. He kind of went with a Zodiac killer type thing. He wore a mask too, which is interesting. Never really been done not never been done, but usually the Riddler used to wear that kind of eye mask thing. Think kind of a la Jim Carrey. Excuse me. It's a little Joker-esque in his performance. Kind of, looks like he pulled a little bit from Heath Ledger's Joker. He laughs a lot, which is interesting. I mean, they're a similar character. If you look at how Jim Carrey played the Riddler, it was a flamboyant version of the Joker kind of thing. So, absolutely awesome set design in the movie. They use this LCD kind of like array, like these giant screens. Instead of a green screen, they actually played like giant TVs essentially. They actually played images or projected images of the actual cityscape or any big huge landscape that they were using in the movie. They actually showed that so the actors could see that. They could react to it. The lighting never changed, which is always a big thing with movies and television. You're always fighting the sun. But with this technology, you can have a sunset happening for hours, which I thought was really, really interesting. Again, the cinematography was really, really cool. The whole feel of the movie is kind of Seven meets Saw, which is really, really interesting. If you've never seen Seven, that's a David Fincher movie. Tremendous, tremendous. And then Saw, which I've actually never seen, funny enough, but you can tell that there's major Saw influences in how the Riddler kind of deals with his victims. It's 3 hours long, and 3 hours is long. Counterpoint there is obviously the Snyder Cut, which was like 4 hours, which I watched and did a whole podcast about. So go check that out if you haven't seen it. But again, movies are getting long, and it's interesting as people's attention spans are shortening, movies are tending to get longer. So it's kind of a trip out, but oh well, what can you do? I think in general, the movie, this movie anyway, highlights the duality of Batman and Bruce Wayne's appearance in Gotham. Every Batman movie talks about Bruce Wayne and Batman's differences and the duality there. But I think it's really interesting. It really talks a lot more, or the movie speaks to, that kind of idea of the Prince of Gotham in Bruce Wayne versus that Dark Knight of Batman, where the city loves the Wayne family and loves Bruce, and he's a god, he's a prince, right? He's royalty in the city, and then Batman, people think he's a menace and a vigilante, and all these things. So he lives this dual life, which is really, really interesting. One thing I really noticed that was kind of caught my ear, so to speak, was the Something in the Way theme. So Something in the Way is a Nirvana song from their Nevermind album. Tremendous, 1991. Tremendous. Oh my gosh, great song. Really intense, deep, sad vibes. The Matt Reeves, I guess, the filmmakers, chose to use this kind of as a theme. They used this song as like a score of the movie. And maybe it's a sign of the times. It's been 31 years, since the album came out. Maybe it's long enough that some of the younger kids watching the Batman movie aren't going to necessarily know that as a song on itself. And then the older people watching it will recognize it and be like, oh, that's cool. But when I recognize it, I'm like, oh, that's awesome to use like once. But they used it like as a theme, and like they kept reprising it and going back to it like an overture kind of thing. And I don't know if that's ever really been done in my in my memory like of an actual song being used as the theme. Obviously, there's soundtracks where there's multiple songs being used, but where one song is used over and over and again reprised and just like a theme. So thought that was interesting. I don't know if that'll be something that continues in filmmaking, but I thought that was funny. Overall, the movie kind of has a similar story to Batman Forever, speaking of Jim Carrey's Riddler. The storyline being the Riddler dropping off different clues and packages for Batman, and then the Riddler trying to reveal Batman's true identity. But this is what the Riddler does. This is the history of Batman and the Riddler. Whether it was the 66 Riddler, Jim Carrey's Riddler, the guy from Gotham, the show, if you ever watched that, the Riddler kind of is this anti-Batman character, right? He's just as intelligent or sometimes even more intelligent, but doesn't maybe necessarily have the physical skill or the necessary like physical effect of Batman, but he can beat him with his mind. And there's a lot of things there, right? There's a lot of different ways to challenge Batman. You can challenge him. If you look at Batman's rogues gallery, so to speak, the people that challenge him are very strong. That can challenge him physically. And then you have extremely intelligent villains that challenge his mind, and you have extremely evil villains that challenge his kind of goodness, so to speak. So challenge his promise to never kill people and do things like that. So those are the kind of ways you can challenge Batman's kind of ways, right? Just like if you're writing for Superman, he has very different villains. Flash obviously has really fast villains, right? Which wouldn't make sense, so this is just comic book writing, I guess, 101. But again, the Riddler always tries to, break Batman kind of mentally. And he's always trying to kind of unmask Batman, and whether in the comics or in the storylines, whether he knows that Batman is Bruce Wayne and he's trying to figure out who he is, or he already does know that Batman is Bruce Wayne and he's trying to get that message out. So that's always really interesting. It really speaks to, the detective Batman thing, where again, Batman has all this technology, and the Batcave and everything becomes kind of like a crime lab, and it's kind of like CSI Batman. So that's kind of the vibes in this movie. It's kind of hard to refer to it as the Batman. It just sounds like I'm being redundant, but that's how Batman is in the Batman. Well, anyway, so in this movie, as I will continue to refer to it as. One little thing that kind of caught my attention was the whole vengeance thing, the whole I am vengeance this, vengeance that, come on, vengeance, blah, blah, blah. It's a little too much. I don't understand what it was. I get it. I'm the knight. I'm vengeance. I'm whatever. Okay, it's cool. It's Batman. That's what he does. But I don't know. It got a little bit too real. Like Selena calls him vengeance at one point before she kisses him. Like, what can you do? Batman, historically speaking, is Mr. Gadgets. He's kind of James Bond-esque in his gadgets. I mean, he doesn't have any superpowers, so he has to rely on all these crazy shits. But one of the coolest things, I felt that this movie really didn't push the boundaries too much. Again, this is only Batman's second year, so he's still kind of like accruing all the stuff that he wants to use and things like that. But there's a really cool thing that I had never really thought about, and I don't know if it's from the comics or something that they came up in this movie, but Batman uses these contact lenses. They're basically like, they're kind of like Black Mirror-esque, but they're like these contact that record everything he sees. So it's a complete point of view recording, and there's sound recording too, somehow. I don't know if it's through the lens or whatever, but Selena Kyle in the movie uses it too, but it's really awesome to think that's how Batman like remembers all the shit that he saw and did. And when he's in these places and looking at documents and then someone hits him over the head with a vase, he doesn't forget all this shit. And again, it's almost like he can watch film of how he does. So it gives him a chance to improve. And like I said, these are the early years of Batman, just kind of like getting to know what he's capable of and what he has to do to clean up the streets of Gotham. Another thing that was awesome was the Batmobile in the movie. It was like based off an old Dodge Charger, which is super cool because, again, it's not like some futuristic one-off car concept thing that doesn't exist, right? It clearly, as Batman was kind of getting started, he picked a car that already works and then modded it. Really, really cool. And then one of the last little gizmos that he ends up, gadgets, if you will, that he uses is this like adrenaline shot thing, which I thought was super cool. And it's definitely been used in some of the comic book stories before, but essentially Batman's beat to shit. He's on the verge of passing out, blah, blah, blah. And when he really needs to at the last second, he pulls this looks like an EpiPen kind of thing out of his belt and stabs himself with it. And he just gets this crazy adrenaline charge. It's kind of like Jonah Hill in Get Him to the Greek. Tremendous. And he just kicks the shit out of this guy. So super cool there. And fuck it. Obviously Batman's using PEDs. Let him fucking juice. One of the coolest things I noticed in the storyline anyway was connecting Thomas Wayne to Carmine Falcone. So again, Carmine Falcone being the mob boss, essentially the crime boss in Gotham City, has a connection with Thomas Wayne, and they allude to it in the movie, and I won't go into it too much. But essentially, because Thomas Wayne was a doctor, he had to perform emergency surgery on Carmine Falcone, and Bruce Wayne, as a young kid, witnessed this. And this storyline comes from Batman: The Long Halloween, which was an awesome comic book series that was released, and it really touches on that whole storyline. So that's super awesome there. And in fact, the first scene of the movie is on Halloween night. So it's really, really, really cool. Such a nod, a great nod to that comic series there. And with Carmine Falcone out of the picture, Penguin is to step in as the crime boss of Gotham. So there's going to be a big power grab there, which again just opens things up. You can tell the end of this movie is really opening things up for more stories to come in, and it seems like the crime is really going to kind of surround this drug called Drop, which is a really interesting thing. And it's always funny in comic book movies anyway. They always tend to like come up with a new drug. It's never like, oh, there's coke coming in or there's heroin coming in. And I kind of thought about this for a second because it was in Judge Dredd too. They used like this future, I mean, it's future too, but they use this like special inhaler kind of slow-mo drug. Again, I think they do this in movies, comic book movies and comic book stories because kids tend to watch it. I don't think it is too much more it's not much more complicated than that. That they just don't want to be like, hey, Batman's busting this guy for heroin. What's heroin? You know what I'm saying? So anyway, it is a really classic storyline. I think one of the most classic bits of it is that it touches, at one point Gotham as a city is completely under attack. And I think that really touches on, Gotham's in danger, Batman. Like, what are we going to do? So it's really interesting. And it kind of highlights Gotham City itself kind of as a character. If you look at the Tim Burton movies or any of the movies, Gotham itself is such a major part. The darkness, the steam and the wet streets and the people and everything, right? Like it itself is part of it. And Batman is sworn to protect Gotham, even if the city hates him. So that's always a fascinating storyline to kind of pursue. One of the other kind of classic bits was the Riddler in Arkham. So I was thinking back on movies. There's not too much happening where Batman is in Arkham Asylum. I think in Batman Forever, he sends the Riddler back there. And then at some points, Mr. Freeze and the Riddler are doing that in Batman and Robin. Or Mr. Freeze and Poison Ivy are in Batman. In Batman and Robin, Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze are in Arkham, I think, for a bit too. But again, none of the movies have really been like, oh, I guess Batman Begins. There's a lot in Arkham with the Scarecrow. But again, that whole idea of like Batman throwing a person into Arkham, it's usually the end of the movie. But in this movie, they kind of had a bit more where Batman finally finds the guy, or the cops find him. They throw him in Arkham Asylum. The Riddler, I should say. They find the Riddler. They throw him in Arkham Asylum. And Batman goes and interrogates him while he's there. And it's really funny because in that interrogation scene, you can see the Riddler's wearing like a neck collar, like a restraint. But it's huge. Like, it looks like you can easily just slip it over your head. So I wonder if that's the filmmaker's nod to how easy it is to escape from Arkham. Because that's what always happens, right? All Batman's fucking enemies tend to just escape from Arkham somehow. So I thought that was really interesting. And then the Riddler and the Joker are basically in side-by-side cells, and they're kind of talking to each other and plotting, which happens all the time. This is just, again, classic Batman storylines, which is awesome. And then kind of a final homage to the old Batman is at the very end of the movie where Batman's fighting all the multiple Riddlers that are all dressed the same. That's super classic, kind of like where all the henchmen just look the same. And, you know, it's easy on the filmmakers because you can just use the same stuntmen. But, you know, it's a comic book thing where it's just, you know, it's the same kind of, they're all dressed, they're all goons. So I thought that was really cool. But, you know, like I mentioned, it's exciting that this is the first of 3 movies in a trilogy. They really left it open at the end there to kind of say that things are going to keep going with the power grabs, with the Penguin moving up, with the Joker and the Riddler planning shit. Super cool. But again, one of the coolest things that I notice in general about this movie is, you know, overall Batman is neglecting his duties as Bruce Wayne. Like I mentioned before, you know, that Dark Knight versus the Prince of Gotham duality exists in his own life that he has to follow. And, you know, with him neglecting his duties, he's also leading to some of the political corruption that he ends up having to fight as Batman anyway. So it's actually really interesting to think about it like that, you know, all this corruption that he needs to take down, and the crime and the crazy characters that as a result that he has to take down as Batman, he might be able to actually prevent as being Bruce Wayne and being more attentive to what happens in the goings on of Gotham City from the political sphere. But again, would he ever have the same power as Bruce Wayne? Potentially, right? Like, that's the interesting thing, is that he's so well known and so rich and famous that he might actually have a lot of sway, but not as much sway as when you can fucking punch people out and be Batman and be Knight and be the Vengeance and all that shit. So, but of course, like all superhero movies, it touches on the duality of the characters themselves. Obviously, they have their superhero character and they have their alter ego, you know. Every Superman has their Clark Kent, you know, every Wonder Woman has their Diana Prince. You know, there's always this other character, and in Batman's case, he kind of highlights it in his own way, where Batman is the actual man, he is the person, and Bruce Wayne is actually his mask. And it's interesting, some of the movies up until this point, like Batman Returns and The Dark Knight, the filmmakers have touched on that, and they've done masquerade balls where everyone is wearing masks except Batman. So that, again, like I said, Bruce Wayne is his mask. He is Batman. So that's kind of an interesting thing where it's, you know, what has happened to Batman throughout his life has made him Batman. It's not the other way around. I think I'll leave you with one final closing thought. I know I just spent about half an hour talking about a comic book movie, and I've done podcasts on them before, and I'll do podcasts on them again. And you might think it's silly, and if you've gotten this far, God bless you and thank you for listening. But just give comic book movies a chance. You know, yeah, maybe they're silly, maybe they're based off kids things. But up until this point, you know, Martin Scorsese says Marvel movies aren't cinema. Listen, man, maybe Marvel movies aren't, maybe whoever isn't, according to you. But you look at some of that Christopher Nolan series, you can't call that not cinema. And yeah, it's based off a guy who wears pointy ears and dresses up like a bat and flies around at night. But again, it opens up ideas and concepts of who we are as people, that we're not always, the person that we want to be. We might not always follow all of our virtues the way we want to. And who we are, in the world is one thing, and who we are at home is something different. And I think that, the line between good and evil runs between the hearts of everyone. And I think that is exactly what superheroes and comic ideas touch on, is that, yeah, Spider-Man might seem like the 90-pound weakling, but he'll swing from the rafters and knock you out. He'll throw a manhole cover at you. The Hulk, where he might look like a mild-mannered scientist, but you piss him off and it becomes something else, right? There's something where we want to live vicariously through that, where we want to feel that catharsis of saying, no, I'm so much more. There's so much more going on inside that you don't know. And, maybe one day I'll take this mask off, or take these glasses off, or put this mask on and show you who I really am. And I think that's the coolest thing ever. And I think comic book movies are touching on that, and the technology that they use now, and the acting and the casting and the filmmaking in general is just amazing. And it's just a new methodology. Yeah, maybe it's a little bit more abstract than some other more serious concepts in movies. But again, the characters are just vehicles for these emotions. And every comic book movie that's been made to date has some type of truth in it that can only be told through these characters, and I think is really cool. But I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. Again, like and subscribe, hit the bell, subscribe to our channel on YouTube if you're listening there. Give us a 5-star review wherever you're listening and watching, please. I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but it means a lot to us at the podcast. Hit us up, DM us on Instagram or on our Twitter at the Bigmark Pod, at the Bigmark Podcast. And go check out our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod, and go support us that way. Thank you so much for listening. Appreciate you. Love you. Talk to you soon. Peace.